Morning, everyone. We will be waiting for a few minutes for most participants to join us today. Welcome to the session. of minutes more to allow for other attendees to join the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending our session today. Greetings from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I can see people are here from all over. Dixon from Japan. Some are joining us from the Philippines. I can see some are joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. There is the chat function here. Please feel free to introduce yourself and interact with all the other attendees here. We are here for an important topic today. How does human rights protection in technology look like? I think this is a matter of big concern for us today, especially with digital technologies advancing at such a rapid pace. And today we will be having three main speakers, John, Len, and also myself. Our welcome agenda today for this session for about 90 minutes. We will be talking about business and human rights in technology and also the status of the business and human rights in Malaysia specifically. But more excitingly, we are very happy to introduce to you our DCDR framework, Data-Centric Digital Rights Framework. It's been a long journey to get here, and we hope that you will learn something today, and we hope to hear from you your feedback on our on this framework. So just a bit of a quick introduction on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Basically, it is a three-pillar framework to get businesses and also governments to employ human rights into their business processes. And the three pillars, as mentioned, is the first one is the state duty to protect, where this is where the government comes in to mandate human rights protection for their citizens. And the corporate, the second pillar, which is the corporate responsibility to respect. Um, well, previously, the the protection of human rights is almost always the duty of the government, and very rarely do we see the private sector go into this space in order to uh, actively have human rights protection or human rights due diligence into their business processes. And this is the framework from the United Nations that encourages business respect for human rights across their business processes. And then the third pillar is access to remedy. Essentially, if to provide avenues for when there are human rights infringements or human rights violations that happen with the company, there should be some mechanism for people to access remedy. Specifically at the IO Foundation, we work on encouraging or bringing the United Nations Guiding Principles into the tech sector. We've been talking to tech companies, technologists in particular, in order to realize their role essentially as the next generation of human rights defenders. Previously, this has been pretty much championed by CSO, civil society, or traditional human rights activists to look into things, topics, freedom of speech, online access to information, anti-corruption, transparency, migrant workers' rights, and things like that. But specifically in technology, the two main fundamental human rights that are in focus would be privacy and data protection. So when we talk about what does it mean to protect human rights in technology, we're not just talking about the internet, because digital spaces also include things that are not within what we online, not just online spaces. So anything that translates ourselves into a digital copy or into a virtual copy is what we call digital spaces. Essentially, the link here, most important link here, is that for ourselves to be, our human rights in the physical space being protected should also be translated into digital space via our data. So our data, being a copy of ourselves in the digital space, should be as protected as ourselves here in Meet Space. And so the jump here is, it's not actually that far when we connect our self identity, our physical body, with our digital body very inherently, and we see no disembodiment, and we see no disconnect between the two. Anything that affects our data essentially affects us. With our digital twins, we call them digital twins here. Our digital twins being existing in the digital space as representatives of ourselves, making digital transactions on our behalf. So, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, the key primary fundamental human rights that needs to be protected in the digital space would be our privacy, basically the rights of our data to be protected, so that we can be protected in the physical space. So this is a graph of how it looks like. Essentially, we have us here in the analog world, and then we transpose. We have our digital selves. Whatever identity that we put online, whatever stuff that we put online, or whatever things that we translate into a digital format, whether it is in a public location, or whether it is in private servers, anything that duplicates ourselves, essentially are exposed to digital harms, and that is and that is where human rights considerations come in, so that we try to protect as much as possible our digital twins. um, we have a teaser. We have here a teaser to a harms matrix that we've developed for data-centric digital rights, which will be explained by Jean in the next section. Um, but more importantly, in business and human rights in technology, the stakeholders that we've identified here are very, very important, because it requires everyone to have that inherent link, that understanding that we are our data. The first stakeholder that is very important are citizens like you and me. We all need to understand that, none of this matters if we don't see that connection between our physical bodies and our digital bodies. So we are not just people who have accounts, Facebook accounts or Google accounts. We are actually digital citizens. We are not just users of these technologies. We are essentially abiding by their policies and their laws. Essentially, the technology companies are acting like the governments of their platform. And so we have all these in the digital rights space. We have this conversation around digital governments and platform governance and things like that. What does that mean if it's not for the users, and if it's not for the citizens who are using these platforms or these technologies as we interact in the digital space? So this is the first step, actually, for citizens to understand that we are essentially we our rights as citizens in the real space, in the physical space, is also the same rights that should be applied to our digital twins in the digital space. So if we have the right to freedom of expression here online, then we also should have, sorry, in offline, we should also have the same freedom of expression to our digital twins. And that's where the first step comes in. And then we need, of course, governments to understand this link, where our data is ours, and this is how governments should show their duty of care. The government recognizes each individual citizen as owners and autonomous bodies, autonomous beings of themselves, with the agency to decide for themselves. And so that understanding needs to be extended to our digital twins, as mentioned earlier. So this is essentially, over the past years that we've been working on this. This is and the reviews that we've made on legislations, and the reviews that we've made on data protection laws and things like that. This is the one key element that's missing, which is that connection that we as citizens and our data are one. And of course, we have the tech companies themselves, not just the big tech companies, but any technology, any businesses with digital components, or any businesses that uses digital technologies to improve their business processes, or their efficiency and things like that. We are not just users of these platforms. we are actually existing there as ourselves, as who, as representing our our analog identity transposed into the digital identity. So whatever happens to our digital selves must be um, as protected as we are in the physical self. So, and then the last stakeholder, the technologies, we have identified them as the next generation of human rights defenders. If we can say that in this pandemic that the first line of defense against a viral disease are the medical officers and the medical professionals, who would be our first line of defense in the digital space if not the technologists themselves? So these all these stakeholders are uh, the components that we have identified as necessary in order to properly implement business and human rights in the tech sector. We have seen companies like Telenor, Microsoft, and Verizon committed themselves to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So what happens is that all these companies have their own version or their own standard on how to protect human rights in their business. What we are proposing here at the IA Foundation is that there should be a standardized standard that uh, protects all digital citizens by way of recognizing their digital twin. Um, they have committed to the principles of business and human rights, and they have committed to protecting the human rights of their employees and their users, and anyone who interact with their business. um, but again, that one key element is again missing, where that ownership of our data is still in third party. Either it be the government or it be the private entity. The fact that users or digital citizens don't own their own data means that it can always be subjected to human rights harms or human rights violation. Just a little bit of update on business and human rights in Malaysia. Malaysia has committed since 2015 to have a national action plan for business and human rights. We at the Foundation have advocated for a specific thematic area for technology, specifically in the protection of privacy and data for technology companies to adhere to. um, we have been working towards having this formally written into the national action plan, and it's still in the works. We have seen some countries having technology as thematic areas or even cross-cutting areas into their national action plans as well, and those are the countries that are pretty much more aware of the effects of digital technologies can have on the human rights of citizens. Right now, it's still ongoing, and we are still working with government stakeholders in order for us to include digital rights protections in the NAP, and we hope that we can see more traction on this soon. This for that section, I will invite John to present on the data-centric digital right framework that we were very excited about. John?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me well, Mariam?
Yep,
Is my
can
up
hear
and
you.
good? Okay, so I'll take over here. Can you please stop the screen? allow us to do this very awkward thing where we need to change screens and share again, etc., and verify that everything is fine. This is one of the downsides of running things online. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, it's visible now.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Mariam, for introducing the session. All right, so let's begin with this. What I want to look into this segment of the session is this data-centric digital rights framework that we have been thinking for quite some time, and how it would be applied into technology in the way it is conceived, in the way it is implemented, and specifically how it also fits into our work on business and human rights in the tech sector. So the problem that we started observing very early, and also one of the reasons why the organization got started in the first place, was that we were observing how governments were losing their place in digital spaces. So essentially, they were losing the race against big tech, if you will. There were a lot of developments where governments were not able to understand exactly the implications of big tech in people's lives. And there was this very interesting shift whereby citizens all of a sudden needed to become experts in technology instead of just responsible users, which is the expectation that we have in pretty much any other product that you can think of. We'll see a couple of examples in the presentation. And there was also this very strange situation whereby, first of all, the actual experts that should be consulted and should be at the center of all of this, which is technologists, and for us, very specifically programmers, were not so much in the table of conversation. They weren't very much invited to be able to design how this was going to be moving forward. But on top of that, they were not provided with the sufficient tools in order to be able to do their job efficiently and to protect citizens in the technology that they build. So why did we got into this? Why did we get into this particular situation? Well, we identified two core problems. There are, of course, many more than this, but the two that we identified, the first one was that we have historically created a misconception about what is the nature of data. And we also have, for, again, historical reasons, not apply the same processes in the way we do commerce or in the way we provide technical services, specifically on public consumption software. That is, the way public consumption software is provided, is introduced into the market, does not follow the same regulations that have been proven to be at least sufficiently protective in the past with any other industry. And we, again, going to be looking into a couple of situations. When I mention about the nature of data, what's really important, as Mariam was mentioning before, is to understand that data only has any value because we can sufficiently contextualize it and know what it represents. And the moment that you do that, you inextricably link the data to its source entity. So if you're, for instance, measuring my age, or you're measuring my height, or you're measuring my interest on buying your next fancy vacuum cleaner, all of that data only has value if it can be linked to me, so that you know that you can affect me in my purchasing process or in my political allegiance or whatever it's going to be. And so that very intricate connection cannot be separated, lest you want to lose any use that you have for the data that you're going to be using. There is this very interesting cognitive dissonance where we think that the data is separated from us, but it's really not the case. And if it wasn't the case, China wouldn't be using and amassing that much data from the public. Okay, so there is a huge correlation here, and we need to start looking at data from a very different perspective. But as I was mentioning, there's also the element of the processes on how we introduce products. And the usual process that we have in any how to say product that we consume or that we enjoy in our societies goes through basically three stages. First, you have the design part, and I'm not talking about the design from the actual design of the product. I'm talking about what's necessary for the product to be on the in the market. And typically, there's a law-making design or there is a standard or research being done, say for instance on carbon emissions and how they can be affecting people. There's a number of open standard working groups usually that are looking into how a certain technology should be implemented. All of that information is eventually falling into the hands of governments, and governments set up a whole framework that has to do with policies, regulation, the law, and typically there's an agency that comes with it, and the agency is tasked to be able to verify that whichever product that claims to be compliant under a specific regulation, it actually is. You can think, for instance, on things such as, I don't know, the electromagnetic spectrum, whereby there is an international consensus on how the spectrum is supposed to be used, but then Malaysia, in this case, for instance, will be deciding, well, we're going to be partitioning our spectrum in this particular bands, and we're going to be using this particular amount of radiation this procedure to assign the bands, for instance, for radio stations or for other types of communications and so forth. And so the run part is, once the whole setup is put on, how is this run? And what typically happens is a company wants to provide a product that is going to be consumed by a specific jurisdiction, let's say, for instance, Malaysia. They will generate a prototype that has to be compliant with whatever has been established during the setup process, whatever the regulation, the law says, and whatever the agency is going to be checking upon. That prototype is provided to the agency. The agency has the tools to be able to verify compliance. Once compliance is verified, they provide it, typically it's a document giving you the green go, and the organization will go and start mass producing and selling. Normally, there's also not only the agency will verify during the run process that things are proper, sometimes there are also civil society organizations that are going to have a second layer of verification, whereby they will be verifying and monitoring that the application of the product is actually properly done. So how does this look like in reality? So let's look at two industries. The first one, the car industry. Being in Malaysia, I mean, you can't really escape this one. So Proton, Perodua, any other manufacturer in the world wants to put a product into the market, in this case, a car. Any product, this is interesting element to consider, that any product is basically composed of two elements. The first one is the compliance element, and the other one is the imagination element, or the value proposition element, if you will. Inside the mandatory compliance, you have a certain margin that allows you to be able to provide to the market different brands, so different models with different features. But if you think about it, none of those features may ever be okay. I'm notified that my slides are not moving for some reason. That's interesting, because I was okay. All right, so I'm going to have to be, that's strange, because I was using the presentation mode. I apologize for this. Did it now change finally for some reason? Okay. Okay, just for the sake of you seeing exactly what is it that I was seeing on my screen, I'm just going to go very quickly here. So that was the problem. This was the why. That was the usual process. Very quick on the examples. And now we are in the car industry. Is it now synchronizing? Can someone confirm? All good now. Okay. Apologies for that. I don't know what happened. I was using the presenter mode, and it should have been shifting the slides because I was seeing the shift on the slides myself. Okay, so going back to the car industry. So let's say Proton wants to issue a model. What it will do is it will build a prototype. It will send it to an agency, which I believe in Asia is the Asia NCAP. The Asia NCAP will run a number of tests, and upon completing all the checks and all the checklists in terms of compliances, a document will be signed, giving the green go for the company to be able to mass produce the car, and the car goes into the market. The reason why this is important is because there's an agency that can verify compliance of the product, and not only that, the compliance is done in a way that at any given time, I can take any car from the street, pass the test again, and it has to still be compliant. That's a very important thing. So what really it means is that there is a reassurance from the part of the user that the car is provided to them in a way that they don't have to complicate themselves about all the intricacies of the technical elements for the car to be safe. All the user has to do, all the citizen has to do, is to be a responsible driver, which is all they should be doing. And all the technical part is just left into the experts. The second example that I want to look into is medicine, healthcare. You have a similar situation here, although we're going to take it from a different perspective. Let's imagine that we have someone who has been diagnosed with cancer. Two doctors have the ability to meet together, have a conversation about what would be the options for an oncological treatment for this patient. They can discuss about things such as what are going to be the chemicals that are going to be provided, what are going to be the side effects, what are going to be the delivery mechanisms, the people involved into it, what's going to be the timeline, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And one important thing is they can have this conversation to prepare what are going to be the options to present to the patient without the patient being present. The reason why they can do that is because they have the language to be able to express all of those possibilities, and they can go through all the possible paths into the options for the treatment and prepare the proposals and then discuss with the patient, and then the patient can choose. The fact that the patient does not require to be in that thinking process is exactly akin to what we see with the cars. I don't require the driver to be with the company who's designing the car. Everybody knows how the cars are supposed to be, and everybody knows how to comply, and everyone has the language to be able to express that. But there's one important extra step when it comes to medicine, and is the fact that, which you can also see it on the car industry, although it's less obvious, if you will, because we don't see that on a daily basis. But when it comes to the healthcare industry, the fact that the doctors and medical practitioners can verbalize exactly what it is that they're trying to protect is what allows them to have a Hippocratic oath. That's the only reason. And what we will see is that technologies are missing that. There is no way for technologists at the moment to be able to say, hey, I'm going to be getting behind the idea of trying to protect technology, because they don't have the language to be able to express what is it that they are protecting. And that's when BHR in tech enters, and so forth. So the solution that we've been looking into in TIF for quite a number of years, in fact, that we've been thinking about this quite deeply, has been to have a DCDR framework, which stands for Datacentric Digital Rights Framework, as well as the UDDR, which stands for Universal Declaration of Digital Rights. It's two steps. The first one provides a framework on how things could work, a paradigm shift in how technology could be implemented. And the UDDR is essentially the tools to be able to implement this as easy as possible. Because what we need to be realistic, that we can't be providing or suggesting a huge shift on technology without providing the tools to be able to do the migration, and without making it comfortable and easy for technologists not only to understand, but also to implement. And so the way this ties up with BHR, as you can read there, is that the protections in technology should be regulated, which was the pillar one, the duty to protect from the government. Design and implemented, which is what the corporation is going to be doing, which is pillar two, the responsibility to respect. In the tech itself, it has to come embedded in the technology. That's what we're missing at the moment. And by doing so, what you hope is to minimize the need for remedy, the pillar three. I personally have quite strong emotions against pillar three, in the sense that it is a non-judicial type of remedial system, which by its own nature is pretty much always going to leave the citizen on the defensive and on a weak position against the corporation that they may be trying to claim against. And so the idea is that, why would you want remedy if the technology is designed and implemented in a way where you don't need it, because it's protecting you by design. I'm just going to be making a double check that, yes, correct, my slides are still working fine. Okay, so this will be a very, very quick line, so to understand exactly how we're mixing all of these concepts. So there will be, we'll be looking into what are the components of the framework now, but basically there is, in this paradigm shift that we are discussing, there will be an easy way to enter, which are what we call the DCDR principles, and also the second oath, which we'll be discussing a little bit further. Also the DCDR framework, which we are preparing at the moment. So this is a work in progress. And once the framework is available, we can start building the GDDR. So to unpack a little bit what the DCDR framework will be composed of, as it stands today in our current stage of the research, is that it will have one set of premises. So of course, you need to have a certain core values and certain amount of ideas that you want to base the framework upon. 3 structural layers, 3 taxonomies, 3 principles, which are the DCDR principles that we've been mentioning, 1 oath, which is the second oath, and one set of stakeholders. We will not get into the stakeholders because those are basically what Marian has been discussing before. I would, however, want to make a very, very strong point, a very, very strong case that the most important stakeholder in here are technologists, and specifically, we see an even more important role into the industry of in the category of technologists for programmers. Anything that you use in technology always have a software layer in between you and the hardware. If we are able to make understand developers their fundamental role as next generation of rights defenders, and we provide them with the tools and the language to be able to get behind that, most of the work is done. So they are very much the core stakeholder. And then, of course, you get the governments, and then you have corporates, you have everything. But if you think about it, one of the cool things about the programmers is they are transversal to all of those categories. They're everywhere. They are in governments, they are in corporations, they are independent programmers, they are in the educational pipeline, etc., etc., etc. Providing them with those tools is going to be the first step to be able to have technology that is just better and safer. That's essentially how it's going to look like. So there's a number of premises that I just want to discuss here very, very, very quickly. I don't want to get into the whole set. They will be available, of course, in the final documentation of the DCDR framework. The first one is to come from the point that, from the starting point that we are our data. And so that informs how the framework is being designed so that it protects that data as if it was myself. If you remember the slide that Maria was showing before, where there was a comparison between the physical space and the digital space, the way we see things working is that the important element is that both in physical spaces and on digital spaces, there's a number of entities that live across time, and that what we are always trying to do at any given time is to try to stretch as much as we can the life cycle of those entities. Think about yourself, your own life, your own existence. In your physical space, you're always trying to not die, basically. That's a stretching. So you are born in time A, you die at some point in time B, and everything we're trying to do is to stretch B as far as possible from A. Any single action we're doing in every single moment of our lives is basically for that. Now, the same can be said for technology. Okay, we have data, we want to stretch the data, and the data also goes through a life cycle. What we thought was that B gets closer to A if we are exposed to a specific harm. There's a set of harms. And that's where the taxonomy is going to come from. And the same happens for data, for the data that represents us. And therefore, harms, what they do is they shorten your life cycle. And rights are the proactive attempt to avoid a harm so that the life cycle can be extended in as much as possible. That's the basic premises that we're working on. And there's, like I said, there's a number of others, and you will be able to have access to all of them once we publish the final paper. This is taking back the slide that Mariam was sharing before. But this shows you is a correlation between the physical space and digital space. And for some time, we were having a little bit of a struggle to trying to tie things up because we didn't pay attention to this particular element. So let me read the slide for you a little bit. On the left side, you're going to have the physical space, and on the right side, you have digital space. In the physical space, we have a number of entities, entity A, entity B. That could be a company, a person, it doesn't really matter. It's just something that exists in the physical space. On the digital space, we have their corresponding digital twins. So for instance, in the case of a corporation, it can be a piece of software that they have published. And in the case of a person, it could be data that represents that person. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this discussion. So as you can see here, there's a number of directions. So you can see in the physical space that entity A can affect entity B. Entity A can affect digital twin B by means of the digital twin A, and digital twin A can affect entity B by affecting the digital twin of entity B. This may sound a little bit complicated, but what it really means is that when observing how harms can be generated and received, we looked upon it from where they are sourced and who is receiving them. From the understanding, as I was mentioning before, that I am my data, and therefore my data in digital space has just as much value as myself, physically speaking. And so this is a mouthful. I'm not going to get into trying to read this, because otherwise it looks like a tongue twister. But you can see that the source can be physical, and the receiver can be physical or digital. Sorry, the source can be physical or digital, and so can be the receiver. And that explains all of these movements here in terms of how harms can be generated. So let's say, for instance, into what happens on when it only falls into the category of the physical world. That is a traditional element of human rights. That's the conversation that we have, where a certain entity A inflicts a harm to an entity B in our physical world. That has been covered traditionally by human rights. So you identify those harms and you try to prevent them by having a list of rights: freedom of expression, freedom of movement, whatever it is, freedom of religion, etc., etc. When we look at it from the DCDR perspective, what we look at are all the harms that can involve specifically your digital twins, that have to do with the technology element of digital spaces, the data, the algorithms, and so forth. So as you can see, we are more looking into the harms that can be created inside the digital twins, even though some of them can actually leak into an entity B. So for instance, an example of that would be doxing. Someone who posts somebody else's address will be using digital technology to do so. However, the final harm might be inflicted into the physical person if someone comes to my house, for instance, and just shoots me. Let's put it this way. Okay. Now, the way we see BHR in tech is when we put all things together, because BHR in tech is essentially the attempt from the UN to remedy the problem that when they issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they did not consider corporations, essentially because back in the days, corporations were not such a big thing. And so as corporations grew and their influence and their control over commerce and even international courts got bigger and bigger, turns out that there was no document in order to be able to at least ask them to be nice. And so BHR in tech comes into place, and it covers not only the human rights aspect, but also the technical aspect of a tech company. Okay, the holistic approach to it is what allows us to consider, let's say, how an employer in a tech company treats their employees, but also their customers. That will be on the human rights part. And how do they issue software that is going to be respectful on the data of their customers, or even also their employees. So when you start looking at all the possible interactions, turns out that you have the full gamut of all of these potential harms, and eventually you want to have a list of rights to be able to protect those. So the DCDR, in terms of structure layers that I was mentioning before, the 3 layers, we have now a structure based on 3 layers. And I'm going to start by layer number 3. So layer number 3, what we are designing is, how does this look like an implementation perspective? So how would different components interact, and how would that translate into the actual protection of those rights, and specifically with the compliance on the BHR side of things. Layer 2 is the explanation as to why the components that we use in layer 3 matter and how they are defined. In there, of course, there's a number of decisions made based on the assumptions and the principles that I was mentioning before on the let me just go back to it. the premises that we were discussing. So that informs which components we are taking to be able to create layer number 3, and they are described and defined in layer number 2. And then layer number 1 is going down a little bit more in the rabbit hole, which essentially is why do the components that we are defining and that we're using in layer 2, why do they exist? Why can you make the case that they actually exist? That they're not a figment of our imagination, that we're just not making them up. Layer number 1 goes down into the actual reality of the space that you are describing. So in this case, for instance, if you're thinking about the physical space, physical space comes with a number of rules, basically the universal regulations. All the dimensions in which we live, everything that has to do with the 5 basic forces, etc., and that composes a universe that creates a reality upon which we can generate the concepts for layer number 2. And what we wanted to do was to not just make up the components on layer number 2. We wanted to be able to explain why is it that we are deciding and why is it that they exist. Well, they exist because they do have an actual reality grounding. And the same happens for the digital space. We also are providing that definition for layer number 1. By the way, I know I might be throwing a lot of concepts in this presentation, so by any means, put your questions, use the Q&A function so we can review them later, and possibly Mariam and Len can also help you with this. So the taxonomies that I was mentioning before, that's also part of the DCDR framework. The harms that we were discussing need to be categorized. There has to be a very clear list of harms. Once you have that list of harms, which is a research that is ongoing, you are able to generate an equivalent list of digital rights. The idea here is that pretty much one is complementary from the other. So our stage of research right now is showing us that you can once you do, I don't want to get into much detail because it really would mean that I have to be explaining what we have right now in the framework for about 3 hours. But let's say that we have been looking into the state of an object and how the state changes over time, and there's only one specific feature or element or property of an object that changes over time in order to have a change of state. That change of state can be generated by either a digital harm or a digital right. There is no actual in between. And so either your state changes towards keeping you extending your life cycle, or either that change of state is going to shorten your life cycle. There is no in between. And so the interesting part is that once you have, it's easier to identify what are the potential harms. And once you have the harms, you automatically have the rights that you need to apply. So what are the proactive actions that you need to execute in order to avoid a certain harm to be executed or to be inflicted? Last but not least, the use cases taxonomy, which is essentially a very strange situation. We've been asking experts all over the place, and we are, it's one of these very weird situations where you are convinced that someone, and there has to be a standard already discussing this kind of things, and there are some conversations, but there is apparently no actual standard, internationally recognized standard on use cases for data. And this is primordial. We need to know exactly what are the different usages that we're going to have for data in order to be able to discuss what's going to be the data flow and what are the possible harms that are going to be inflicted upon and what are going to be the ways we're going to be protecting that. And it also helps, for instance, to think about it from the perspective of data minimization. If I cannot categorize what kind of use cases my data is going to go through, I won't be able to establish in advance what is the minimum set of data that are going to be required for that case to be implemented, so that we can make sure that, for instance, no more data than is strictly necessary is provided for that particular use case. This is tied up to something that I wasn't expecting to discuss, but I'm going to make a very short parenthesis here, which is all of this conversation about ethics in technology. The issue that we have with ethics in technology is that I personally don't know what they mean by that. We understand what ethics is, sure. The problem with ethics is that it is culturally attached. The ethics systems of Malaysia is not the same as mainland China, it's not the same as the US, not the same as Japan, it's not the same as Hong Kong. And so when someone tells me we're going to be building systems that are ethically driven, my first question is, okay, which ethical system are we talking about? And the second thing to think is when the data is going to be moving from one system to another, from one platform to another, upon different jurisdictions, are they going to be using exactly the same ethical system? I don't believe so, because ethical systems are not universal. That's the main problem. And so the reason why we look at rights, it's because any single harm that can be applied to data will equally be applied regardless of the jurisdiction and regardless of the person. That does have a universal component that ethics systems do not have. So we prefer to look into technology from something that will not have borders, because in reality, it doesn't have borders. The data is moving all over the place. And we need to make sure that wherever it goes, the premises by which the algorithms are implemented are the same, and it's not going to work from an ethical perspective. I can put my hand on fire on that. So, as I was mentioning before, by the way, on the structural layers, the status at the moment is work in progress. So we have quite good progress on the framework, although we think that there's more work to be done. For the taxonomies, it also is a work in progress, and it very much derives on having more work done on the structural layers, even though we already have a preliminary list on what looks like to be a good amount of digital harms. And of course, use cases is kind of much more straightforward work. In terms of the DCDR principles, this is the first shift that we wanted to do. So when we're thinking about, okay, so how we're going to be implementing this, how we can bring together all of this approach into BHR and to try to make it adopt by tech companies, we immediately thought, well, it's going to be taking a lot of time. And the first thing you need to do is change minds. It has to be an actual change in the paradigm thinking on how technology is built. And we thought, well, if we are waiting for the whole framework to be done and the UDR to be out and the DR SDK, which is part of the UDDR, to be out, it just takes too much time, and it's not time that we have. So we thought about first having something that could be a nice conversation starter and that could be easy for technologists to understand and to remember. We were thinking more along the lines of having this Gemini Cricket type of thing, like in Pinocchio. That is basically the voice of your consciousness telling you, hey, please keep these things in mind. And so we came up with 3 principles. Principle number 1 is I am my data. And basically it's summarized into, treat others' data as you would like to be treated, because there's actual no difference. Principle number 2 is end remedy, which essentially means design your system so remedial solutions are not necessary. In other words, let's imagine, for instance, GDPR in Europe or PDPA in Malaysia. There are provisions for if someone figures out that a company has been misusing data, they can sue the company, etc. Okay, fair enough. And if I request my data to be deleted, for instance, they have to comply. Otherwise, if I'm informed that they didn't comply, I can take them to court. Well, why would I want that? What I want is when I request the data to be deleted, that it is deleted. End of the story. If I learn a few years later that didn't happen, I'm happy to have the possibility of taking them to court. That's fine. However, what I want to have is the reassurance that when I request, if they are compliant, they will actually execute that by design. In other words, I don't want to have just the ability to sue the car manufacturer if my ABS braking system didn't work. I want it to work by design. And I want an agency to be able to test that it works, so that when I buy the car and I get into my house, I don't have to concern myself as to whether the ABS is going to work or not. It will work, because there's been verifications and checks and balances for that to be reassured to me. The funny part is that we don't have that right now in public consumption software. So NRemedy is essentially that idea. Design your system so that you don't require your users to go and have to activate remedial systems. And principle number 3 is basically the conjunction of everything is rights by design. It's one step further from privacy by design, which you may have heard as a kind of a common concept floating around. We think that that is just only covering one element, that what technology should be doing. And the idea is that, well, if a specific jurisdiction is telling me that this is how you are going to be compliant, the compliance should be embedded by design in the technology. And that includes not only hardware, but also the software part. So those 3 ideas are not difficult to get behind. They start already providing language for programmers and for technologies to know what they are discussing and what they are trying to prevent, and try to get us one step further to what we were discussing before with the healthcare industry, whereby by having the vocabulary, which by the way is the digital harms, digital rights, and use cases taxonomies, that is the vocabulary. But by having those concepts as a vocabulary, then we can move into making them having an oath, which at this moment, so we issue something called second oath, which is a very, very direct translation. Len can provide with a link on the chat about the second oath, and I believe also on the DCDR principles. The second oath is essentially, I wouldn't say word by word, but we inspire that from the modern Hippocratic oath, and we turn it into an expression of, I am a technologist and I want to pledge that I'm going to be helping people. And I want to make sure that the technology that I build is going to be properly designed so that it helps them instead of harming them. We, of course, use the concept of the DCDR principles inside the text. That's a work in progress, even though it's ready in the sense that people can use it already. We'll probably open a consultation phase in which we're going to be asking people to provide a much more original, less copycat, if you will, from the original Hippocratic oath. But it's a first step. Right now, there isn't anything that allows technologies to read it and say, oh, I actually understand what this means. I like what it means, and I want to get behind it. There is no verbalization of all of those concepts, and so it becomes very ethereal, and programmers do not become part of the solution with the way you would like. And as a bonus, Len will also drop into the chat what we call the Hey Big Tech Declaration, which basically is a number of concerns and of comments that we do to, and kind of commitments towards big tech at the moment. It started as a conflict that we had in the organization as to either whether we wanted to use or not social media in order to provide exposure about the work that we were doing. Originally, we didn't want to because of the abuse of data. Eventually, we realized that it was a problem for us in terms of communication. We were not reaching out to enough people. So we tried to find a compromise solution by which we declare very clearly, listen, we know that we're using you because we need the outreach, but we don't agree with what you're doing. Feel free to also use any of these and share them around. So I'm gonna, let me just double check timing. I think we're good so far. And I'm also gonna be checking if there's anything on the Q&A. I think I'm going to be showing this for a moment. Okay, so Lucia is asking us, how does data-centric protocols such as DCDR framework associate or have dialogue with existing and upcoming legal initiatives? Would you have, do you mean things such as GDPR or any other initiatives that are coming up? Can you clarify that on the chat, please? Or I can even bring you to the stage if you will. You can ask the question directly. Lucia? Okay, so GDPR, or example, what you're doing with the AI, the DSM. Yeah, so we still haven't been looking into how they intersect. I can tell you, for instance, when it comes to GDPR, what it does is it complements whatever GDPR says. One of the main problems on GDPR is that any data protection law at the moment in the world, okay, it's not only specific to GDPR, it's happening everywhere. They are only issued as a very nice piece of paper with very cool intentions, but no indication whatsoever on the actual implementation. In other words, if a company claims that they are GDPR compliant, there's no really good way to verify that. You can hire a very expensive consultant that will go through your code base and they will, run a number of tests, etc., and they will sign a paper claiming, yes, they are compliant. But me as a user, I don't have that possibility of verification. And not even the Data Protection Commissioner does have the tools to do that. What they have is remedial systems. Again, back to the same problem. If you detect that someone hasn't been compliant with GDPR, you can bring them to court. And in the case of GDPR, is extraterritorial, so they can, you can bring a US company into court, even in the US, if they're not complying with it. Fair point. And I prefer to live in a world where GDPR exists rather than not. The problem is, again, if you give GDPR to any programmer and you tell them, build me an HR management system that is compliant with GDPR, they don't quite know what you're talking about. They understand what you're trying to do, but you're basically asking them just, make your own initiative on trying to figure out how this is going to be compliant. And so that's a problem on itself. What you need to be able to provide is the same way that you have with the cars. These are the type of emissions that are going to be acceptable, and this is the way we're going to be measuring them. Up to you to build your car however you want. That's the way it's going to be. Okay. Now I have not only the specification, but also have the tools to be able to verify my compliance. In the case of technology, we can go one step further, by which governments could actually provide SDK, software development kits, with the compliance embedded to it. So that if I want to be GDPR compliant, I just have to integrate my DR SDK inside my stack. And I can only need to concentrate on my business logic and my value proposition, but the compliance part is done as an interface to the DR SDK. So that's the way we look at how we can actually integrate that in existing initiatives. We haven't taken the step to be able to give you an answer as to this is the way it's going to look like very specifically, but it's the way we look at the integration. Anything the governments are going to be issuing as regulation should be not only a piece of paper, but also an actual tangible piece of software that you can incorporate into your stack. That essentially has value in the sense that it reduces the risk. So it's a de-risking approach for companies. Now I don't have to concern myself either I am or not compliant, because my compliance comes from actually incorporating the SDK that is issued to me officially. The agency that is verifying this, for instance, the Data Protection Commissioner, now has the ability to have a number of APIs that are embedded into the product to get a copy of the product, put it into a sandbox, run a number of tests. 24 hours later, you know if you are compliant or not. That wouldn't be a big stretch. And the cool thing is it also levels the playing field for every single company. Right now, being GDPR compliant is a lot of money. Small companies, small startups can't compete. They need to have the data protection officer, etc., etc., etc. That's more and more and more money for companies that usually start with very little capital and they're struggling to actually get into the market. Big companies, basically, they just budget for it. They budget for the fines. Facebook doesn't really care about being compliant, because worst comes to worst, if they get caught, they're just going to be saying, oh, we are in Ireland and we're just going to be bringing these things to the court and we're going to drag this for the longest time, and good luck with it. And so it can't be just a remedial system. It has to be a proactive technical one. And providing such an implementation would allow companies who get into the market to play and to confront big tech at exactly the same playing field when it comes to that kind of compliance. I hope that answers the question. I'm going to be going to see this number of questions more. So Jeff is asking, let me see, show on stage. Life is global, living is local. Standards cannot be dropped over the planet with proper fit and finish. Yes, that is correct, for as long as your data is also not moving globally, which is the case at the moment. So the technology itself is not being designed in a way that has the protections that we need directly embedded into them. That is the main challenge. That's the main challenge that we identified. And the people who are building this, which are programmers, are not being trained and not providing with the tools and the knowledge in order to be able to proactively protect it. You may have a local living, which is, by the way, something that we have already looked into the framework. We call an area, which is essentially the space that you occupy across time, and that impacts a lot, precisely in what you're meaning, because the way that you look at how technology can affect you has to do as to either a specific technology or a specific harm intersects with your area. So the place where you're going to be, or across time physically, but also digitally. That's part of the going down in the rabbit hole of layer one. And so the protection that you want, for instance, that you look into, let me finish reading to make sure that I'm getting the last part. Attention to what the target community is built for is fundamental onboarding technology to be developed. Sure. The thing is, if you look at the community part, that's more on the ethical system, and that will be more on the local regulation part. What we are concentrating upon is how technology is built in general, at large. For as long as data is going to be moving from one system to another, what you require is those two systems to be in accordance to one set of principles. And those set of principles, for as long as they are aligned with ethical systems, there's always going to be conflicts. If you want to, I mean, the perfect example on how a multivariate system of ethics put together doesn't work. It's the word is at conflict all the time. That's your test ground. There's plenty of cultures, there's plenty of countries, there's plenty of different interests, there's plenty of different ethical systems. Those are the ones that clash, and those are the ones that end up in wars. If we keep looking only at that and that particular narrow-minded vision, and we don't look at the universality element that is, we are all humans, it was going to be impossible to design technology that are going to be protected. I hope that answers at all your question, Jeff. As to Mariam is also mentioning here. Yeah, I believe that this is a call to action. She's a request from Mariam in terms of being in touch with legislative efforts to recognize citizen ownership of their own data. Yes, the vocabulary in there is quite confusing for the general population, and it's we don't find it to be very, very conducive, and there isn't any initiative that we know of to be able to understand or to recognize the link with ours and our data, which is a very strange thing, I have to say, because we keep insisting on the concept of consent. How can I give consent upon something that I don't own? So it's a very strange cognitive dissonance that is happening there in how how we are legislating across data. So we look at the ownership of data, but for some reason no one is doing that very simple step to recognize, well, I own it and it matters because it's me, it represents me, and for as long as it does so, well, it should have exactly the same protections. We make the case several times that data protection laws may not have been necessary to begin with. We think that there were other mechanisms to protect data, specifically constitutional law, if you have done that association between me and my data. Okay, going back to this, and I'm going to be trying, because I'm in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into too many details, because otherwise there will be no more space for any Q&A or for more other questions. But I wanted to provide a very quick example on how DCDR framework should be functioning, specifically in the context of BHR and tech. We had an experience, one of our members had an experience with one of the most predominant e-hailing companies in Southeast Asia, by which the account of this user was deactivated, and the whole process on how things, which we documented, because we thought about doing something about it maybe one day. in order to show that that wasn't the way to do a feedback loop between a company and the users. Essentially, that user got their account canceled with no prior indication. That's a real problem in terms of feedback loop. Trying to log in, that user was redirected to a website whereby the user could send a request to ask what happened. That request does not provide, at the time that we tested it, doesn't provide a receipt about that particular request, and any response is then sent through SMS. So those are absolutely three disconnected platforms. So the app itself, a website, and then SMS communication system. And there is no interconnection across any of them. That leaves the user in absolute indefension, and they will not be able to provide any feedback from what's going on with their situation. The company has a very specific position of control as to how the information is being provided. It's the responsibility of the user to piece together all of these different steps in order to make the case that, hey, I've been claiming this 10 times. We actually claim it as a, we repeated the experience several times in order to find if there was a consistency, and it was always the same thing. And there was never an actual answer provided by the company that was at all satisfying. It was all canned type of responses. And what it really leaves is the user in a place of indefension. I believe that's English, but not being defenseless. What you would like to have in a much more, let's say, proactive and much more safer and better way would be the example that I wanted to provide you based on what we have right now with the DCDR framework. Unfortunately, as the one that I have in the screen, we weren't able to cram the whole diagram in the screen, so I'm going to try to be explaining it as easy as possible and just gesticulate with my hands, without looking like a fool. So essentially, what you need to have is what I was mentioning before. Feedback loops are an essential component of technology that should be standardized. The way conversations are going from the app that you are providing all the way to be able to register all the possible conversations, as you would have, for instance, in it's very typical nowadays. You go to the website and there's a chat there to be able to talk with the company directly. Normally, you have a list of previous conversations and so forth. But that should be integrated at all steps of communication, allowing you to have an integrated standard way of providing feedback for things that may malfunction in your application, problems that you'll be experiencing as a user, and even feedback requests to service UX requests from the company in one single interface, with the possibility of see the whole historical on how that data has been generated, who has had access to it, when it has been responded, and so forth and so forth, and the ability for that to have an access control system that allows, in the case that you want to escalate and request for a remedy to the corresponding agency or corresponding ministry, or even a civil society organization that might be looking into it, so that you can actually provide access to that. And all of that should be seamless. It has to be done in a way that is standard, in the same way that every time I get into a car, even if it's not my car, I know that braking is braking. There's no reason why a feedback loop should look 25 different ways. It can be improved over time. You can have more features. You can have even, like as we was discussing before, extra value proposition. Sure, you have a product, you want to put it into the market. You have part of it is compliance. The other part is value proposition on top of that compliance. The bare minimum is the compliance, and that has to function. Minimum set of features, minimum set of interactions, minimum set of information that has to be kept. On top of that, if you want to work on the colors, the interface, I want to add a couple of more features on it, fantastic. That's your extra value proposition, and it allows you to compete with other companies so that your feedback loop system is better than theirs. Fine. But the way I'm using it is going to be, to the very least, the baseline is going to be the same wherever I go, whatever application I use. That would allow people to not have to reinvent the wheel every time that they're having a feedback loop system. for the user, for the citizen, not to have to relearn again how to use this particular thing, because the very baseline is going to be the same. And then whatever extra value proposition where they learn about it is the difference between me driving a Perodua and driving, let's say, a Porsche or a Ferrari. They're both cars, they both accelerate, they both brake. The Ferrari has more buttons and more flashy things and more flashy stuff. Okay, I'm going to have to learn it if I want to be able to make use of those functionalities. But that is extra value proposition. It does not hinder the fact that it's a car, and the car, by design, should be keeping me safe. Again, we will not have much time because it's just 12 minutes to the end, but we wanted to mention that we are working on, Mariam has been working very hard on 2 documents. The first one, BHR in Tech Guide, that will be a template as to considering BHR and considering the DCDR framework, how you can use it to generate a proposal for a national action plan on your specific jurisdiction. What would be the different kind of a checklist type of thing? What are the questions you need to ask? And how you can propose your policy brief. So it will be a reference document that we are putting together. And in particular for Malaysia, we are also about to finish the specific policy brief for the National Action Plan, as Mariam was mentioning, that we are involved into. And we are trying as much as we can for the Malaysian government to see this as an opportunity to include technology as a thematic area. So far, technology has been not discussed as a thematic area in any national action plan across the world. It has been introduced as cross-cutting issue and sometimes a special mention in others. The problem is that we see that technology is really much going too fast. Governments are not catching up. One of the problems that we were mentioning at the very beginning of my exposition. And they need to start recognizing that as a core element in their national strategy, and specifically in the National Action Plan. We see that Malaysia, because of the different characteristics of the country and the timing, has this opportunity to be at the forefront of it, and we hope that eventually they will be considering in a much more proactive way. And I would very quickly want to go on a very quick Q&A, and I will always remember the same thing. The only foolish question is the one that you don't ask, so don't be shy. I'm just going to be reviewing as well the chat, just in case anything has come over here. Jeff, you were mentioning something about indefensible, and also you were mentioning upon, let me just go scroll in, the Technorata and the Desiderata. Would you want to come to the stage and tell us a little bit more about that part of the work? If you give me the green light on the chat, I can invite you to the stage. You shall not be pushed. That's fine. That's fine. The mic is fine. I'm inviting you to the stage. You will be receiving an invite. Just accept it. Go. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining.
Hi there. You got me okay?
You got me okay? Yes, we can hear you well.
Cool. Thank you, Jean. Once again, I'm so grateful to be in your company. I very much enjoy your effort in your community and your intention. Do you have any echo on me at all?
No, I personally can hear you very well.
Great. I'm glad. Yeah, you know, the idea of a Technorata, and I look forward to the Sagan Oath. I've just been focusing on the idea, and I think even we have talked about it in other communities, the idea of establishing a harmonic so that wherever a community needs to contend with a technological contemplation, that organizations like this can express the idea of respectful relationships, and the communities can take that harmonic tonality. You know, there's a sort of universality at a certain level. A friend of mine was talking today about 528 hertz or something like that being this like frequency of the universe. There's like a tonal bed of the universe. I don't know what he was talking about, but it was an interesting idea. And I would always think about how the intentions of communities like this can express a technocratic oath, or at least the idea that we find people where they are, we deliver technologies to those communities at that point of need in a way that fits their community. How do they express currency? How do they log currency? Is it, sticks? Is it reputation? And then how can you convert that to the larger world? So while we look to help people benefit from technologies across the board, how can we do it in a way that's amoebic and formative to fit the way they are without forcing this upon them? And that was kind of what I was getting at. Indefensible, I was just sort of throwing a word out there. I think you were talking about something at one point, and so I was just throwing that out. But at a larger level, yeah, the idea of just creating a harmonic that's recognizable by large communities. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Jeff. So the idea is that the point that I was making before about the ethical system versus the right system is specifically on that universality. And so you can always have a community that may want, as you said, run their own software and run their own understanding of things. At some point, for the at the very moment that they will be wanting that data to be accessible outside or shared with others for whatever reason, I'm not even entering into that. That's part of the case scenarios. That's part of the use cases. Their understanding on how the technology has been implemented may not be reflected in that destination, which is exactly what happens nowadays. As in, you have a number of regulations protecting you on the EU. Once the data leaves the EU and goes to China, too bad. We don't know exactly what the hell is going to go on over there. And so what you require is to have a paradigm shift in technology that looks at those minimal common denominators, and to make sure that to the very least those are covered by design, so that community, even though internally they may be doing things differently, if any of the data is shared with the outside, they have the reassurance that it will not be misused beyond what has been declared as this universal taxonomy of digital harms and digital rights. You want to have that reassurance, which is something that you don't have nowadays. It's going to take quite an effort. It's not a straightforward thing to do. And for us, the way to do it is to be able to inform programmers so that they are the ones who initiate the change, and that change goes and permeates into open standard working groups. The concept when it comes to technology, one of the cool things is that you can have I wouldn't call it a shortcut, but I mean, it will be the smart move. It's not to go to what the government is regulating, it's to go to the open standards that the governments are adopting for them to regulate. And so you look at things such as, biometric systems. I don't want to be having to confront 25 different governments telling them, listen, this particular regulation on biometrics will be counterproductive because of this and this and this and that. I would prefer to go and talk with the Open Standard Working Group, who's going to be looking at the baseline on how biometrics are supposed to be used, so that they declare that a certain amount of operations are not to be done by design. So when a government incorporates generates their own regulation on biometrics and looks at what are the open standards available over there in the world, and they look into this one, for instance, their baseline understanding and their baseline legislation will already be contemplating in all of these elements that shouldn't be done by design. I hope that answers. Okay, so I'm going to check if there's anything else. There seems to be no more Q&A. Okay, so we invite you to join us for the working groups that we are putting together for the different elements, or the dataset layers, but also the taxonomies and so forth. These will be happening here in the Take Up space. Last year we were already having a working group on the UDDR. We're going to be expanding that to UDDR, but also the DCDR. In fact, Jeff was part of the of that particular group, and we'll be restarting the regular meetings to steering committee to be able to further pursue the research on the DCDR and also the UDDR. So if you ever are interested, you have two options. You can contact us directly through our email, or you can, after this, we're going to have a matchmaking session on the fluid space where basically everyone's going to be in the same area. We can just get together and create groups spontaneously. Or you can reach out to us, like I said, by email, and we will give you the agenda on how the steering committee is going to be meeting, starting possibly sometime in June. That's going to be the schedule in mind. And finally, what I always repeat, and I will never get tired of this, we are not the people anymore, okay? We are the cyborgs. And if you think that this is an overstep, if you think I'm exaggerating, I invite you to give me your mobile phones for a week and to have this conversation again with me by that time, okay? The fact that our phones, our devices, our laptops, anything, the fact that they are not fused with our body does not mean that they are not part of us. There's no way for most common people to work anymore without it. There's no way for most common people to communicate and to interact with the rest of their families or their loved ones, etc., etc. It is just another sense that we have incorporated. It uses a very bad set of interfaces, essentially your eyes and your thumb, to move around, which is a very inefficient interface. It's still an interface, and it works as an extension of you. So we need to understand that the data that has in there is a piece of your limbs at this point. And there's very interesting movements that we need to be very, very concerned about on how companies, specifically Apple, for instance, are rebranding themselves into service companies, not hardware companies anymore, but service companies, by which those extra limbs will eventually be leased to you. That's where most of the industry is moving towards, into leases, to not selling anymore. You will not own, because now I own my phone, and I can claim that because I own it is a piece of me, and as a result, any data that I generate with it belongs to me. That's an argument that I can make. The moment that the phone does not belong to me anymore because it's leased, it will be a very, very different type of situation. In other words, think about when you rent a house, you cannot do everything that you want in the house, and you cannot consider it your house. Your landlord can always kick you out. Even you can bring them to court, even if it was an illegal or unfair expulsion from the premises, still the situation will be the same. It's very important that we understand that we are our data and that our devices are an extension of us. The sooner we do this, the sooner we can make the leap on changing the way we think about technology and the way we protect ourselves with technology. Thank you so much. That will be everything for today in this presentation. I hope that you did enjoy what we've been discussing. It was very information intensive, I know. We will be doing other sessions explaining further the layers of the DCDR framework. We didn't want to cram everything together, and we will also see more examples on how it plays into BHR in tech. The idea here was basically to see that BHR in tech is the application of the United Nations Guiding Principles on business and human rights in the tech sector, and that there are ways for them to be able to incorporate better understanding of technology, a better understanding how data functions, how it is interrelated with citizens, and how to protect the whole thing so that citizens can do what they are supposed to be doing, just to be responsible users. That's all they are supposed to do. Right now, this big disconnect between experts and users is not existing in public consumption technology, specifically software, and we need to go back to those roots where the experts take care of the problematic thing, the experts take care about all the complexities, and the citizen just takes care of enjoying the technology as a responsible user. Thank you so much for coming. We will be closing the session now, and we invite you to join us into the fluid space, which is, you can see it on the schedule, is right after this session. Thank you so much. Keep safe.